Okay, excellent. So I'll start back from the beginning. So welcome to our Let's Get Visual training. I'm Auburn LaRose, and I'm a health promotion specialist at Wellington Dufferin Gulf Public Health on the health analytics team. I'm presenting today with Amy Estel, and she's a health promotion specialist on our family health promotion team. So we created this training and all of the tools associated with it in response to the need of our family health promotion team. The team is looking for tips and tricks to make highly effective visuals with both quantitative and qualitative data. We've adapted this training slightly so that it fits the need of a larger audience, and that's what we'll be presenting today. So although the tools were created for our health unit, we encourage you to use them and adapt them as you see fit. So today's presentation has three main objectives. The first is to understand the basics of data visualization and infographics. The second is to learn skills and collect tools to create effective visualizations. And finally, to find creative inspiration for your visuals. We've tried to make this webinar interactive by including polls and some discussion questions, and you can also ask us questions at any time by posting a question in the discussion box. So, to get started, we have two questions for you that we're hoping you can fill out with either your group that you're with or just on your own. So the question is, tell us about yourself, what organization are you from, and how many people are listening together? And we'll give you a few seconds to answer that. So we'll give another 10 seconds for you to finish up your answer, and then we'll let you know who you're listening in with. Okay, great. So we have some local folks, so some people from the city of Guelph. I'm also seeing some people out west, so we have the city of Surrey, Calgary, the city of Vancouver, other people in Ontario, so we have Peel, Wellington County, so lots of different people. Sudbury, I see you're there too, Durham, Toronto, lots of people from Toronto. So it's great to see a wide representation. Oh, and St. John, East Coast. So it's great to see a wide representation of everyone here on the call today. Thank you very much. So, as I mentioned, we initially created this training for our internal staff. So our health unit had purchased the books that are shown on the screen, and Amy and I were tasked with pulling out relevant content and presenting it back to staff. So as a result, many of the concepts and key points from today's webinar have been adapted from these three fantastic books. If at the end of the webinar you're interested in learning more about data visualization, we highly recommend purchasing one or all of these books. And we also have a list of recommended online resources for you at the end of the presentation today. All right, so let's dive right into a bit of background on data visualization. We'll call this section Data Visualization 101. So, what is data visualization anyway? So we're going to start with a quick definition here. So data visualization is the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. So let's break this definition down a little bit by looking at the three most important parts. So the first is data. So data is the raw material. So data could be names, amounts, groups, statistical values, dates, comments, locations. It can be textual or qualitative, or numeric or quantitative in format. And the thing with data is that typically we get it in data sets that are in table form, where we have rows of records and columns of variables. And when we look at data in that format, our eyes have a really hard time comprehending it.
Our eyes and our brains are not equipped to easily translate the textual and numeric data in a table into quantitative and qualitative meaning or relationships. And we need meaning and relationships to help us compare and contrast and to derive understanding from the data. So we need to see it represented in a different visual form. And that is the art of data representation. The next keyword is presentation. So when we talk about presentation, we're talking about the method you use to display your visualization. So we're talking about format, design, color, sizing, placement, layout, captions, explanations, the amount of interactivity, really everything that goes into presenting your visual. And the last keyword is understanding. So understanding is what people take away from the data that you present. You can't assume that two people looking at the same data will come to the same conclusion. So your job as a presenter of data is to guide their understanding and to present data in a meaningful way. So in summary, data visualization is the means of communicating data to make it meaningful. Data visualization can vary from simple graphs to detailed infographics. And knowing how to create and use visualizations effectively will really mean the difference between providing value to your audience or information overload. And we all want to avoid information overload. So, in order to help us really understand what data visualization is, we're going to take a quick look at some examples of different types of visualizations. And we'll start with the traditional graph. So traditional graphs are really useful visuals for conveying quantitative data to an audience. We're probably all really used to seeing bar graphs and line graphs, so they may feel really comfortable to us. But it's important to note that reading something like this might not be second nature to everyone. Graphs are most often used to visualize comparisons between two or more numbers. So in the case of this graph, we're comparing Wellington Deaf and Guelph data to Ontario data, and we're also making comparisons between different age groups. This graph on the screen might not adhere to all of the best practices that we're going to talk about later, so please keep that in mind, and those best practices will really help people to interpret what you want them to interpret out of a graph. But we'll get into that, all the different types of graphs and when to use them and how to make them effective a little bit later. So to carry on with some examples, we're going to move along to a timeline. So timelines are a great way of visualizing trends over time. So this is a really cool example of a timeline that shows the rate of measles cases in different states each year. So the years are along the bottom of the chart, and each square represents the number of cases of measles per year. So this is both a timeline and a heat map. So don't worry, we'll get to what all these things are later. But basically, the heat map portion has different colors on the timeline. So the light blue is approaching 0, and the red is approaching 4,000 cases of measles. So this is a really great way to quickly show in a visual manner how the number of measles cases rapidly and sustainably decreased across all states after vaccines were introduced. So really cool example of both a timeline and a heat map. This is another really neat example of a timeline that uses visual tactics to display progress on projects in creative ways. And this is a more qualitative timeline. So it might be a bit hard to see on your screen, but it presents information about progress on different projects as opposed to numerical information like you saw in the timeline, in the previous timeline and heat map. Infographics. We're probably all familiar with infographics. So infographics are graphic visual representations of information, data, or knowledge intended to present information quickly and clearly. So they usually tell some kind of story or convey some kind of point. In this case, we have two infographics on the screen. The one on the left is an infographic created by our health unit to display marriage and family data from the 2011 census. And on the right is one of the DIY infographics created by the Community Data Program that you can use and plug your own kind of local data into. Here's another example of an infographic. So you can use visuals to convey qualitative content as well, not just numerical content. So this is an infographic style visual created by Auburn that shares textual information about breastfeeding and how breastfeeding helps a baby, and it does that in a visually appealing and accessible way. So we thought we would share that one with you as well. So those are just some examples of different types of visuals, and we'll get more into different types of visuals as we go along.
And we're just seeing a question in the chat box about what infographic software we use. There are a few that we use within our health unit. PictoChart is a great online option. We also use Adobe, and this one on the screen here was mostly created in Excel, actually, or sorry, in Word, actually. So you're able to sort of modify what you have to create the infographic that you're looking for.
And we'll get more into best practices with infographics towards the end of the presentation. All right, so we now have another opportunity for some discussion. So let's see, I'm going to open up our poll again. So you should see a poll kind of on your screen that just popped up. So we're wondering, how long have you been visualizing data, and how do you typically visualize data? So if you could type your answer into the poll box, that would be great. All right, so we'll give you another few seconds to answer. And if you're answering on behalf of a group, you can maybe put in a range or share some examples of what the different people in your group do. So we're seeing some people who have lots of experience, some people that have 10 plus years of experience, and some people who are newer to data visualization. We're seeing lots of experience with quantitative visuals, so charts and graphs, bar graphs, maps. Some people who have some experience creating infographics as well. Let's see what else is in here. Microsoft Office charts, GIS software, InDesign, which is more of a design software. So lots of different and varied experience here. So we hope that as we go along, if you have experience to share, please feel free to share it in the chat box as well. Okay, so we'll close that poll. And we'll continue on. So why does data visualization matter? So as you can see, data can be visualized in a variety of different ways. But really, in the end, we visualize data to tell a story or convey a point. These days, we are overloaded with information and stories, and we need some way to set the stories that we want to tell apart, and to make our stories credible, and to make them shine, and to make them easily accessible. And that's what data visualization does. Research also tells us that data are more persuasive when they're shown in graphs and charts as opposed to paragraphs and tables. Research also shows that adding a visualization to your data makes your findings seem more credible. And this means that people are actually persuaded more easily when they see visualizations, and it allows them to make quicker and better decision making and leads to quicker and better change. So, I mean, that's what we're all striving for. So when we use visuals to combine numbers with stories in a quick and accessible way, the information becomes more meaningful to people, and that's what it's really all about. Great, so we're going to go through some of the data visualization basics. We're going to take you through a simple 6-step process to help you create effective visuals. So on your screen, you'll see the 6-step process I just mentioned. This process works for projects at all scales, so whether you're wanting to create a single graph, an infographic, or a whole report. We've also created a worksheet to help guide you through this process, and we'll be using this worksheet for this part of the presentation. You should have received this along with some other documents from the Community Data Program prior to the webinar, but if you haven't, you're also able to download it in the right-hand side now. I should note that this process that's defined in the worksheet is not always a linear one, even if it is arranged into steps. So the first 2 steps, understand your data and define your purpose, are a bit like a chicken and an egg.
Sometimes you start with a purpose and then examine the data, and other times your data drives your purpose. So complete the steps in whichever order makes the most sense to you. For the purposes of this webinar, we'll be using some of the recently released 2016 census population data as our sample data. As you can see on the screen, we have population counts for 2016 and 2011. We also have population change over time. We have dwelling information, population density, and land area figures. And this data is displayed for census subdivisions in the county of Dufferin. So as we go through our sample, this is what we'll be referring back to. So the first step is about understanding your data. You'll likely have a lot of data to sift through, so it's about taking time to explore what your data is telling you and to figure out what you want to include or exclude. Focus on data points that add value to your message or are important to your audience. There are a few questions that we'll answer with this step to help guide you in this process. So the first is, what type of data do you have? Is it quantitative, so mostly numerical, or is it qualitative, mostly text? Next question is about what your data is telling you. So what are your key findings? Which data supports your key message? And finally, are there any limitations on sharing your data? What can and can't you share with different audiences? So if we're using our example from the census, the first question, what type of data do you have? The answer is we have quantitative census data for 8 census subdivisions in Dufferin. And what is our data telling us? Well, if we go back and look at the sample, what we're going to focus on here is population percent change from 2011 to 2016. If you take a look at the very end here at Shelburne, we can see that the population of Shelburne has increased by 39% over 5 years, which is huge, especially compared to the other CSDs in Dufferin County, and it's actually the second fastest growing census subdivision in Canada. So this is something that we really want to highlight. So our data is telling us about population changes over time, and it's telling us that Shelburne has increased more substantially than other CSDs. And finally, there aren't any limitations to sharing this data. It's all aggregate and it's publicly accessible data.
Just to take a quick pause, we're getting a message about mic volume. We're getting reverberation, so we might. Does that help at all? How's the volume now? If someone can just type in the chat box about whether that seems to be a good volume. Better? Okay, good. Clearer? Better? Okay, hooray! We will continue then. So we'll continue on with step 2. So step 2 is about defining your purpose, and it really helps you to nail down what you're trying to accomplish with your visualization. So it's really important to think through step 2 so you can structure the format of your visual to help you accomplish your goals. And as we mentioned before, you might come into your process having an idea of your purpose first, and that's okay, that's totally okay. So this step can either be done first or second. So we've come up with a few questions to help you define your purpose. So the first question for step 2 is, what are you trying to accomplish with this visualization? So think about what you're trying to accomplish. Do you want to share knowledge, generate conversation, inspire action, or is it something else entirely? The second question is, what tone are you trying to convey? Is it a reading tone? So when we talk about reading tone, we're talking about facilitating understanding with a high degree of precision or detail. Or is it more of a feeling tone, where you're putting more emphasis on the gist or sense that comes from your visual and not necessarily on precise facts? Are you trying to take a serious tone, or are you trying to take a funny tone? These are all really important things to help shape and choose what kind of visual you'll put together. And the last question is, what data will you include in your visual? So this is really about looking at your data that you've analyzed and thinking about which of your findings serve your purpose, so serve what you outlined in the first question. And we really encourage you to be selective here. We encourage you to think about which of your findings are actually useful and add value to help you serve your purpose and for your audience. And going through this step is so important to help limit that risk of information overload that we talked about a few slides ago. If we're only selecting data that serve our purpose, then hopefully we won't have that information overload. So we'll go through the example. So the example using the CDP data. So what are we trying to accomplish with our visualization? So in this case, we'd really like to highlight Shelburne's population growth to help with system planning, so to help with distribution of resources, and to help with service needs across Dufferin County. We'd like to convey a reading tone, so we want to facilitate understanding with a high degree of precision or detail, and we want to take a serious tone. And this is because our expected audience, this is what they're going to expect. We need to make sure that they understand and they can trust in the findings that we're sharing, so we need to present them seriously and with a high degree of precision. And lastly, what data will we include in our visual? So in order to avoid information overload, we're just going to include percent change over time from 2011 to 2016, and we're going to include comparisons with other local census subdivisions.
Okay, so the next step is to define your audience. You'll do this by asking yourself the following questions. So first, who are you creating this visualization for? So who is your target audience? You might have just one audience, or you might have multiple audiences with varying levels of comfort, experience, and knowledge with the topic or with the data that you're presenting. If this is the case, a one-size-fits-all approach to data visualization is less effective. It will be important to complete all of the steps on the list for each of your target audiences. Next, consider how comfortable your target audience is with interpreting data. Do they have a high or low level of data literacy? This will help you to decide how simple or how complex your visual should be. And next, how will they access your visualization? So how will you be sharing it with them? Will it be on paper, in a presentation, or online? This will impact the type of visual that you use. Being able to provide verbal context to your visual during a presentation is a lot different than using your visual on a website and relying your audience to interpret your visual independently. Next, what does your target population care about? So what questions do your target audience need answers to? What will they find useful or interesting or inspiring? And how will you combine your target audience's interests and the findings from the data to frame your key messages? So here you're going to write out some of your key messages. Going back to our example, we're creating this visualization for executive directors of agencies that provide services to Dufferin County and to local politicians. We're expecting that they would have a medium level of data literacy. We would expect to provide this data in a presentation and also to provide them with a report brief to take away. Our target audience cares about meeting the needs of the community and securing adequate funding for services. And how will we combine our audience's interests? So our key messages will be Shelburne is the fastest growing community, is the fastest growing community in Dufferin, and without increased funding to services in Shelburne, the needs of the community will not be met.
All right, so step 4 is really the brainstorming phase. So it helps you get some preliminary ideas on your paper before you dive into creating your visual. And for someone like me that doesn't maybe necessarily consider themselves to be artistically inclined, I find that this step can really help the whole visualization process seem less daunting. So there's 3 questions to this step, and they're really just about getting your brain thinking about elements that could appear in your visualization. So the first question is, what keywords come to mind when you think about your visual? And so for this step, it's all about just brainstorming keywords that relate to your key messages and data and just writing those down. The next step is what mental images come to mind. So again, this is just about brainstorming mental images that relate to your key messages and data. And you might sketch those out, or you might just write out a list of words about mental images that come to mind. And the last question is, what inspiration can you draw from elsewhere to help you shape your visual? So this is where you get to do some detective work, and you get to look for inspiration from other sources. And in this case, Google is your best friend. So really just going onto Google and typing in, population growth change graph or population growth infographic, and seeing what else has been put out there in the world. And maybe there's something out there that will inspire you for your visual. So we'll run through our CSD population growth example. So in terms of keywords that come to mind when we think about our visual, we think about people, growing, expanding, community, and services. The mental images that come to mind, this one was a bit trickier, but we thought about maybe people or houses, trees to represent growth, or connectors. It was a bit tougher for this topic. And then inspiration, what inspiration could we draw from elsewhere? So we did some Googling, and we found a few examples that we liked, so I'll show those to you now. So the first one was this Census Metropolitan Area Growth Chart that we found on a news website, and we liked how they presented the data here. We thought it was very clear, and it clearly showed the differences between growth and different CMAs, and so we really liked that one. We also liked this map that showed, again, population change in different areas, and they mapped it out. So we thought potentially one of those could work to visualize the data in our community. And before we move on from step 4, we got a question. Should we consider the time available to produce a visualization also? Yes. We'll talk a little bit more about time later. But yes, time is a big factor, and from our experience, it always takes longer than you think it will. So just, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that's a very good point.
Okay, so the next step, step 5, is about developing your visual solution, and this really is the most exciting step. This is where you actually get to create your visualization. Choosing the right chart for the right data is very important. We have many different visualizations at our fingertips, so we're going to go over some of the key visuals and how you can create them effectively. Here you can pull out your handy-dandy chart chooser that we've provided you with. It gives a brief snapshot of the visuals that you have at your fingertips, as well as some tips and tricks about when to use them and how to use them effectively. So in this step, you're really going to focus on the question, which type of chart or graphic works best for your type of data, purpose, message, and audience. I should note here that the data that we're going to present in this section is not real data. We've just pulled together some mock data to illustrate some key points. So the first example is using simple text. When you just have one number or two numbers to share, simple text is a great way to communicate this. Make the number as prominent as possible, using a few key supporting words to clearly make your point. Consider using an accent color to accentuate your point. Here we've changed the color of walked to school to match the data point to really tie it all together. And you can also add an icon that represents this number for more visual effect. Pie charts are really hard for the human eye to interpret, so if you look at this pie chart, for example, consider which slice you think is the biggest. Now if we add data labels to that chart, we see that in fact it's probably not the one that you were thinking, and this is because our eyes have a lot of difficulty judging things like volume and size in some cases, depending on how it's presented. So when you have multiple numbers to communicate, pie charts or donut charts are not really effective at doing this. However, these types of charts can be effective when you're only showing one number. So going back to our daily walking to school, we can use a pie chart effectively here by graying out all the pie slices except the one that you want your audience to notice. Begin the colored pie slice at the 12 o'clock position, and just keep everything nice and simple, and that will effectively communicate those results to your audience. Tables are another visual that you can show quantitative data with, but it's important to note that tables interact with our verbal system, meaning that we read them. So when you have a table in front of you, usually you have your index finger out and you're reading either across rows or down columns. Tables are a really great way of communicating data to a mixed audience who only might care about one row or one column. So if you look at this table here, we see 3 different variables across the column. So the percentage of mothers who did not take folic acid pre-conception. We also have the percentage of mothers who smoked during pregnancy, and the percentage of mothers who did not breastfeed exclusively until 6 months. And we have that for 6 of our areas, and again, this is mock data. So in this case, you can effectively communicate information about maternal health behaviors to, let's say, a health promoter who's working out of Clifford, who may only be interested in the first row of data. Or it might be effective to present it to a lactation consultant who's only interested in the last column of data, since she works across our entire region. Tables are also a great way to communicate multiple units of measure in a single visual. So let's say, for example, that you have counts, you have percentages, and you have rates. You can do this all in one table, whereas if you're looking at a lot of the other visuals that we have at our fingertips, that would require 3 different visuals. So it's really about what your audience needs and when. To make your table more visual, you can turn it into a heat map to draw your audience's attention to key values. So we've done that here, and to turn your table into a heat map, you can color in cells with high numbers in a saturated color, and then color in cells with progressively smaller numbers in progressively less saturated colors. This will draw your audience's attention to the highest numbers in your table. So for example, when we're looking at this data, the lactation consultant that I mentioned earlier, so looking at the last column of data, will now be drawn to the 90% of mothers in Mapleton and the 88% of mothers in Orangeville who do not exclusively breastfeed for 6 months. So that allows her to get data a little bit more effectively and quicker when they're looking at the data. Depending on the data that you have, you might want to draw your audience's attention to the smallest numbers, so the opposite saturation rule would apply. The smallest numbers would be in cells that are most saturated, while most saturated with color, while the biggest numbers would be in the least saturated cells. Okay, so bar charts. Sometimes bar charts are avoided because they are common, and this is really a mistake. So we should be leveraging bar charts because they are common. This means less of a learning curve for your audience, so your audience will spend less time trying to decipher how to read your graph and more time figuring out what to take away from the visual. So our first example here is a vertical bar or column chart. So this is great for showing change over time, though it's important to keep time across the x-axis. So here we're seeing the percentage of students with high self-esteem has decreased since 2010, with years, annual data across the x-axis from 2010 all the way to 2014. Another option is a horizontal bar chart, and this is great when you have no time intervals and when you're comparing different categories, especially with longer names. So here we're seeing that students in Erin are most likely to report feeling safe at school. So we have some of our census subdivisions across the y-axis. Imagine trying to squeeze this into a vertical bar chart and trying to squeeze in the words Center Wellington along the x-axis. So that's really not as effective, and that would be a good time to use this sort of bar chart. Horizontal bar charts are also a great way of showing survey data when you want to include the whole question in a graph. And you could also include full sentences as one of your category labels along the y-axis. Next, we have stacked bar charts. So these are great when you're comparing part-to-whole relationships or totals and subcomponents. So for example, Likert scale responses across categories. Here we're seeing that the students in Wellington are most likely to report being unsatisfied with their school. So you can see it's a Likert response from very satisfied all the way to unsatisfied for 3 of our geographic regions: Dufferin, Guelph, and Wellington. Best practice suggests not displaying more than 4 subcomponents. It's also important to note that it's hard to compare subcomponents beyond the bottom series because your audience doesn't have a common starting point. So here it's really easy for us to compare unsatisfied across the 3 geographic areas, but comparing satisfied, so that light gray section of the bar, is a little bit more challenging for our eyes. If you're doing this, you might want to make it easier by highlighting the component of interest or using data labels. So this is one type of stacked bar chart. This is the 100% stacked because all of the components add up to 100%. But another option is using a stacked graph in which either percentages don't add up to 100% or you have counts instead. So here we have the title, More Employees Work Out of Our Guelph Office than all other offices combined. And we have counts of employees, public health inspectors, health promotion specialists, and public health nurses that are working out of each of our 4 offices. The next option is a line chart. So line charts are most effective when showing trends across time. And again, time should read in chronological order along the x-axis. So here we see by 2015, Dufferin had the lowest rates of infant mortality across our region. So we have the 3 areas again, Guelph, Wellington, and Dufferin, across intervals of time, so from 2009 to 2011, all the way up to 2015. Some key tips for line charts. So don't label the data points unless you want to annotate specific values. So you might want to draw your audience's attention to the highest point or the lowest point or maybe a specific milestone, but really don't put any more data labels on your graph. It's also best practice to not use more than 4 lines per graph. So this data works really well for a line graph because we only have 3 geographic areas. But what if we were considering township level data? So now this graph looks really confusing. We have all of our townships along the right-hand side there, and we really can't tell what this graph is telling us. And this is where small multiples come in handy. So here what we've done is we've pulled out each township so it has its own mini chart. We've ensured that each mini chart was scaled the same, so the x and the y-axis heights are the same, and so the size of the graphs are also the same, to allow for visual comparison. We've only kept the y-axis on the first graph of each row to give perspective to the others. Then what we've done is use color to highlight the key townships we wanted our audience to notice. So our title says, since 2009, the rate of infant mortality has consistently increased in East Garifraxa, Puslinch, and Orangeville. And that light blue color corresponds with the 3 graphs that we really want our audience to notice. Another option is slope graphs, and these are great when you're showing trends across 2 different time points, particularly when one category has changed at a much faster rate or in a different direction than the others. So here we see overall substance use is declining among youth, but rates of alcohol use is increasing. So we see that chew tobacco rates, cigarette smoking, and marijuana use has gone down from 2010 to 2015, but the opposite trend is true for alcohol. It's gone up from 25% to 44%. A tip here again is to show no more than 4 lines and use a color to accentuate 1 or 2 lines of interest. Dot plots are another visual option, so they're flexible and they're easy to read. They're great for showing growth, progress, gaps, or change over time. And if you're working towards a goal or benchmark, you can show progress by adding in a vertical benchmark line to the graph. So here we're seeing kindergarten readiness increased between fall and spring. So we have 5 different areas of kindergarten readiness. We have literacy, language, mathematics, science, and creative arts. And we're seeing the percentage of students in fall in the dark blue and spring in the light blue that are ready. The last 3 graphs that we presented, so the small multiples, the slope graphs, and the dot plots, these are not default graphs in Excel. So instead, you have to channel what we're calling your inner Excel ninja to create these. So to make it easier, Amy and I have created an Excel file with templates of each of these charts, and we've sent that along with the material before the webinar. So the files provide an example of the charts and step-by-step instructions for creating them. The next option are scatter plots. So these are an excellent way of showing a relationship between 2 quantitative measures. They help you visually explore the absence or the presence of a relationship. So here we're seeing that ice cream sales increase as temperature increases, and the dot plots show the ice cream sales by the temperature. Scatter plots don't work too well if one or more of the quantitative values has limited variation. So meaning that the majority of values are clustered around the same point, because when this happens, dots overlap and it's difficult for your audience to see points clearly. That also probably means that there's not a relationship between the X and the Y values, so this probably wouldn't be a great chart to choose. A variation of this is the bubble plot. So this is the same idea as a scatter plot, but the size of the circle changes depending on a different variable. The sample graph here shows the percentage of the population with a post-secondary degree along the y-axis, and the percentage of the population living in low income along the x. The size of the bubble depends on the population of each township. So the bigger the bubble, it means the bigger the population. Next we have pictograms. So these are a fun way to visualize data. So in these visuals, the number of the symbols demonstrates a value to your audience. So a single symbol might represent 1 or many units. One symbol could represent 1 person, or it could represent 100 people. So here we're showing that 1 in 10 pregnant women report alcohol use. Make sure that your symbols are intuitively recognizable as possible. We use Piktochart or Adobe Illustrator at our health unit to create these, and again, we've used color to accentuate the things that we really want our audience to see. Qualitative data are usually the result of engaging in interviews, case studies, focus groups, and collecting open-ended comments on a survey. While these tools have been effectively used to show while the tools we use to effectively show qualitative data are limited, they can be quite powerful. So when individual words have meaning, you can visualize words in a word cloud like you see on your screen right now. It's important to note that the purpose of a word cloud really is not to drive new insight. Really, word clouds just show the most frequently used word. They're just something to visually appeal to your audience and to supplement other information that you provide. We created this word cloud on Wordle.net. You can also use quotations when you have qualitative data and when comments from a survey or an interview have meaning. So here we encourage you to use color to pull out 1 or 2 keywords. If you have consent, add a photo to humanize the words. And when the photo of a speaker isn't an option, maybe the comment is anonymous or you don't have consent, add an icon or a photo that represents a key point from their quote. Stephanie Evergreen has also put together a great qualitative chart chooser document. It should help you to brainstorm some creative ways to display qualitative information and present it effectively. So we put it up on the screen here, and we've also included a link for you to browse later.
All right. So the next part of step 5, so we're going to call it step 5, part 2, is about developing your visual solution. So once you've chosen the type of visual solution that you're going to use, then it's time to think about how to make that visual solution as effective as possible. And so your worksheet takes you through questions that address 4 areas of developing your visual solution: text, color, distractions, and arrangement. And the best next step is to actually sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and to start to sketch it out. And that may seem like a scary thing if, like I said, you are not artistically inclined like myself. But this step isn't about creating a perfect and beautiful first draft. It's just about starting to get an idea of your visual elements, their placement, and their potential colors. And you don't even have to show this step to anyone if you don't want to. So don't be afraid and just go for it. And we've created another tool that we call the Chart Design Checklist to help you effectively design your visualizations to build on the questions from the worksheet. So when you get to this step in the worksheet, you can flip over to the Chart Design Checklist and use that checklist to make sure that you're designing your chart using best practice principles. So I just want to note that we created that checklist for our own health unit, like all of these other materials. So if you find it useful, feel free to adapt it to your own organization so that it suits your needs. So we're going to basically go through that checklist in a bit of a lightning round about chart design. So we'll take each of those elements kind of separately and we'll break them down. So the first element is text. So when we're thinking about text, these are the best practices. So first of all, use agency fonts if you've got them. So we've got agency guidelines that outline what fonts we should use. So in our case, it's important to stick with those. Make sure to use a descriptive chart title to describe the key trend in your visual. Your chart title can be so powerful. It basically guides the reader to what you want them to interpret from your chart. And using a descriptive chart title is probably pretty different than what you're used to seeing in, say, academic articles or even lots of government reports. Even a lot of our own reports here don't use descriptive chart titles yet. What we usually see are generic titles that just describe what data are in the chart as opposed to what the chart is telling you. So we would recommend avoiding those generic titles, using a nice descriptive chart title to help guide interpretation, and also left aligning that chart title in the upper left corner of your chart. We also recommend using subtitles and annotations to provide any additional key information if needed. So those subtitles and annotations can help your reader further interpret your graph. And this helps us to make sure that everyone looking at the same chart will come to the same conclusion and gives people the context that they need to come to that conclusion. So it really just helps people along. We also recommend labeling the titles of your X and Y axes if your chart has them, but not if you also include data labels. So just use one or the other. We recommend that text should be hierarchical. So this means that titles should be in a larger font than subtitles or annotations, and those should be in a larger font than labels, and labels should be in a larger font than source information. So basically your smallest text is kind of your least important text, and your largest text is your most important text. But we also should note that the smallest that your text should ever get is about 9 point on paper and 20 point on screen. Text should be horizontal to make it easy to read. So unless it's labeling the y-axis, it should never be vertical or diagonal. It's just much too hard to read, and we want to make interpreting our graphs as easy as possible for our audience. The second last point here is use plain language over complex language. So this means really break it down, say it as simply as possible, choose fewer words over more words, and define any specialized language that your audience may not know. And also spell out acronyms. So in the first graph, if I'm thinking back, we had the acronym WDG. Our audience probably doesn't know what WDG means, even though it means something to us. And lastly here with text, we recommend using pre-attentive features. So those are things like text size, italics, bold, underlining, and spatial separation to help draw attention to certain parts of the chart or the text around it. So that was text in a nutshell. We'll move along to color. So when we talk about color, consider using agency colors if you have them, using color to draw attention to key numbers, bars, pie slices, dots, or lines in your chart. And we recommend using the same colors to accentuate key words around your chart, and if it makes sense, graying out all other parts of your graph or corresponding text that you don't want to draw attention to. Make sure that when you choose your colors, when printed in black and white, the colors that you have chosen are still distinguishable, because you never know how your target audience may print your visual. And make sure that your visual is accessible, and this includes accessibility to colorblind people. So in this case, don't use red and green, and consider using other types of symbols to help with accessibility. So moving on to distractions. So it's important to eliminate distractions, and you can do that by removing the border around a graph. You don't need that. Removing or graying out grid lines, unless they help with interpretation, but in most cases, grid lines are also not necessary. Remove or gray out the numerical axis. If it's a horizontal or vertical bar graph, use data labels on the bars directly. You can also add data labels to pie charts, slope graphs, dot plots, and clustered bar graphs. Consider removing the categorical axis. If it's a vertical or horizontal bar graph, use category labels on the bars directly. You can also add category labels to slope graphs, line charts, pie charts, and key points on scattered dot or bubble plots. Consider removing legends and just labeling the bars, lines, pie slices, or dots directly. Alternatively, you can use colors in the chart title to show labels. So the dot plot example in the chart chooser document that we sent out has that feature in it. Avoid special effects on bars and lines like 3D, shadows, or transitional shading. Those aren't really helpful. They just add to distraction. Avoid unnecessary tick marks on your axes. Again, those are just distracting. And really think about the precision that's needed for your data values. And this goes back to your audience. So think about whether your audience really needs to see the data to a certain number of decimal places, like 45.1 and 45.12, or whether they just need to see a nice round number and that's good enough. This will help us not clutter our charts with unnecessary numbers. And lastly, in chart design, we need to consider arrangement. And so the first point under arrangement is avoid charts that rely on an individual's perception of area. So those are charts like Auburn mentioned before that are pie and donut charts, or that rely on people's interpretation of volume, like a 3D chart, or curvature, like a curved bar graph. Research shows that human eyes and human brains have a difficult time accurately interpreting those. Really pay attention to the alignment of your visuals and text on a page. Make sure to organize make sure to organize elements on the page to create clean vertical and horizontal lines. And this helps establish a sense of unity and cohesion and really makes your visual look professional. And in this case, left alignment is your friend. White space is also your friend. So don't cram your visual with items just because you can. White space makes the chart easier to read and more visually appealing. Don't stretch your graphics to fill the space or simply add things to your graphic because there's extra space. White space actually gives the eyes a break and ensures that only the important things are included. Arrange your data appropriately. So in this case, for example, time should be on the x-axis and it should be read from left to right. So with January on the left to December on the right, for example. And if your chart doesn't show time, data should be arranged from largest to smallest or vice versa in some kind of logical order. Make sure that your axes start at 0. Be careful of truncating axes of bar charts, and in most cases, it's best to have axes start at 0. For bar charts, make sure that you have appropriate spaces between your bars, and what's recommended is that spaces between bars should be about half the bar width. And make sure that you have consistent intervals and spacing on your X and Y axis to ensure accurate interpretation. So that was a lot of information. That was the lightning round, and so let's see all of that information put into action. So in this part of the presentation, we're going to take a default Excel chart. So basically, it's what you would get if you just clicked on Insert Chart from Excel. And we're going to transform it using best practice rules to make it more memorable and effective. So follow along with me here by looking at the screen as I describe the changes that we've made to this chart. So first things first, we deleted the border. We don't need that. The second thing we did was delete the grid lines. Then we changed the labels on the x-axis. So you can see that right now we have diagonal labels. That was the default. So we shortened the labels so that they could appear horizontally. But we also noticed that March and April were whole words while the other ones were abbreviations. So then we changed March and April to make them all 3 letters. In step 4, you'll notice that the y-axis changed to make the major units 1.0. So before there were the 0.5 units in between them, and that was just distracting and unnecessary, so we removed those. In step 5, we're going to remove the legend here. So the boy and girl legend disappeared, and instead we labeled the lines directly. And that just makes it easier to read and clearer. We then changed the colors in the graph to match our agency colors. And we decided to highlight boys and gray out girls, because in this graph, boys is really the trend of interest, and that's what we want to pick out and help our readers to notice. And the last step, there's a lot of stuff going on, so I'll break it down here. So the first thing we did is we added a descriptive title with colors. So our title is, Since July, boys have experienced more head trauma than girls, and you've noticed we've highlighted boys and head trauma in the same color to match the boys trend line. We have added a y-axis label to show that we're looking at rate of head trauma per 1,000. We added some annotations, so we drew a line here in July because July was a really important month for our program. July was the month where free bicycle helmets were given to girls, and we actually put that in as a text box in our graph. And then we put in an interpretation. So helmets have prevented trauma among girls. Free helmets should be introduced for boys too. So that's what we're trying to show from our graph. And lastly, we made sure that the font was consistent with our agency font, which is Arial. So from this to this, we hope you can see how this is a much more effective and memorable graph.
Okay, great. So we are now on step 5, part 3, so almost done. The thing here to remember is that visuals take time, and this is to the point that was brought up earlier. You need to make sure that you're giving yourself lots of time to create the visual that you want to create. As Amy mentioned, lots of times you will run out of time. You think that visuals might take a certain amount of time, but they usually take about twice as long as you expect, so really give yourself a lot of time. And the reason visuals take a lot longer than expected is because you need to give yourself time to experiment with different types of visuals, different colors, different annotations, to really see what helps to convey your chart or your visual as effectively as possible. And the other thing to consider here is what program should you use. So we mentioned PictoChart earlier, also Excel. Within our agency, we have some infographic templates that we use. So I'm not sure if your agencies have those, but that's something to consider just to kind of speed up the infographic process. And the next step really is to go ahead and create it. Once you've determined what you want to create and what tool you're going to use, that's where you head. So for the example that we provided earlier around census data, we decided to use Excel to create our visualization. We chose to go with a bar graph because we wanted to show how much more Shelburne grew in comparison to the surrounding townships. We chose a horizontal version of that bar chart since we wanted to include the township names on the graph and wanted to give them enough space along the y-axis. A bar chart also worked well for us since we weren't showing time intervals. We're just showing one number. As you can see here, we've used a descriptive title to tell our audience exactly what we want them to get out of the graph. We have written Shelburne had the highest population growth of all townships in Dufferin County between 2011 and 2016. So a more generic graph might just read population growth by township, and that doesn't really tell your audience what you're hoping to get out of it. So this one really pushes the point forward. We've used an agency color to highlight the Shelburne bar and its percentage, and we've used that same color to highlight keywords in the title. We've arranged the bars from smallest to largest to increase reading ease, and we've removed unnecessary distractions, like the x-axis is gone and instead we've used data labels. We've removed the grid line and borders, and we've also chosen to remove a y-axis label that would have probably read something along the lines of Dufferin County Census Subdivisions, because we know that the title is explaining that. We feel like we could use this graph to effectively get our point across about population growth across Dufferin County, and we could supplement it with a verbal rationale for increasing funding to the town of Shelburne.
All right, so step 6 is the last step in the process, and this step is really important. It's about testing your infographic, refining it, and finally sharing it with your target audience. So the feedback that you get through this step will let you know if your visual is on the mark, or in the case where it isn't, will give you an idea of where to make changes and focus continued changes to the visual. So in this step, it's really about collecting feedback and then spending a bit of time away from your visual so that you can look at it with fresh eyes. And when you do that, it's important to ask yourself, is the main message clear? Are the charts effective and easy to understand? Is it on brand? Is it visually appealing? Those types of questions. So really there's 3 guiding questions to help you through this step. The first is, what feedback do your colleagues have about your visual? And when you're getting feedback from your colleagues, it's important to pay attention to what others pay attention to in your visual. Pay attention to the observations they make, the questions they have, and the ideas they have for better getting your point across. And not only is it important to get feedback from your colleagues who maybe have more technical feedback or best practice feedback, but it's also important to get feedback from people in your target audience, because they may interpret your visual and the text very differently than your colleagues based on their own experience and knowledge. So if possible, if you have time, test your visual with your target population. And pay attention to the same types of things. So what does your target population pay attention to in your visual? What observations does your target audience make? What questions does your target audience have? And what ideas do they have for better getting your point across? And then lastly, the last question for step 6 is, how does your visual need to be changed in order to accommodate the feedback? So this is about considering all the feedback that you gained from your colleagues and your target audience, and then actually making changes to your visual. And then the most exciting step is share your visual. And this is what we've been trying to get to all along. And it's important here to make sure that you share your visual in a way that is accessible to your target audience. And when you're getting feedback from people in your target audience, you can even ask them how they would like to access or receive your visual. And their answers might surprise you. And I should note that even though feedback is really captured here in step six in our worksheet, you can gain feedback from your colleagues and your target audience at any step of the process. So in the step, I think it's step 3, where we're describing our target audience, you may want to connect with your target audience to learn a little bit more about them, to learn about what they care about, and what they would want to see out of a visual, so that you don't have to wait all the way till step 6 and then go back. So really, if you can connect with stakeholders in your target audience along the way, the more you can do that, the better your visual will be, and the more relevant it will be to them. So we have a little example. So this is straying a little bit from our CDP example, but we wanted to give you an example of some visuals that we have actually tested, or we're actually in the process of testing these here at the health unit with our colleagues and with our target audience. So these are some visuals about the impact of alcohol on our community. And the goal of these visuals is to strengthen awareness and understanding of the social and financial impacts on the broader community of high-risk alcohol use. So in this case, our target audience is the general public. And in order to, we worked with a committee and a marketing company to come up with these draft visuals. And in order to test these visuals, we created a survey that was distributed to our partners, and we asked them to distribute that survey to their clients. So hopefully members of the general public. And in order to test these visuals, we asked survey respondents 4 questions. The first was, how effective is each message at representing the campaign goals? How appealing is each message to you? And we had Likert scale options for those 2 questions. Which graphics approach do you prefer? So do you prefer more of an infographic approach or a photographic approach? And what is your general impression of the graphics approach for the campaign? What do you think about the layout, color, and images? And then lastly, we asked people about what methods would be effective to share these visuals with them. So we gave them a whole list of different potential methods like online, newspaper, doctor's office waiting rooms, mail, and we had them select which ones would be effective ways of reaching them. And so we did that survey, got a lot of great feedback. We actually got over 275 responses, so that will really help to shape our campaign. We're really excited about that. We also tested these messages, or these graphics, with our colleagues by asking the questions I described on the previous screen. So we basically noticed what they noticed and took away from the visuals, saw what questions they had about the visuals, and made notes of their ideas for improvement. So our next step will be to bring all of that feedback back to our committee, and the committee will then redesign the visuals, taking into account that feedback, and we'll take steps to distribute them broadly. So very exciting.
Great. Okay, so we did also want to touch on infographics briefly. As we mentioned, that 6-step process can be used for infographics or it can be used for single graphs or charts. However, we know that infographics are of a lot of interest to people attending today, so we wanted to touch on some of the best practices here briefly. So infographics are a great way of visually presenting a group of data to a targeted audience. However, we recommend considering your purpose and your target audience before jumping into the potential lengthy process of creating this infographic. So go through the 6-step process to see if an infographic makes sense for your purpose. Does your target audience need a quick summary to supplement a longer report? Do they like infographics? Is your data conducive to an infographic? And do you have the time to create one effectively? So consider those key questions before selecting this visualization. When designing infographics, follow the same standard guidelines that we outlined earlier. So considering things like text, color, arrangement, and eliminating distractions. Also start with your most powerful piece of data so that your audience is hooked. Order your supporting information so that it builds towards a clear conclusion and a call to action at the end. It's a good idea to either focus your information around a central image or to arrange your information in rows of 2, 3, or 4 columns. And for AODA purposes, which are Ontario's accessibility guidelines, it's important to note that if you're posting this on a website or sending it electronically, screen readers have a difficult time reading infographics, so be sure to have a written summary of what is contained in the infographic. The infographic should not be the only way that your audience is getting this information. We have included 2 tools here to help with accessibility. So both can help to improve your visual to make sure that things like contrast and size of text and those sorts of things are applied when creating your infographic. So here is an example of an infographic that is both focused on a central image and uses columns to organize information. So I realize it's a little bit small to read, so I'll read it out loud for you guys. It starts with a powerful opening. So the title is "We're All Zebras: How Rare Disease is Shaping the Future of Healthcare." And the opening is just a small paragraph that says, "When you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras." Dr. Woodward told his medical interns in the 1940s to teach them the art of diagnosis. So it starts with a quote that is kind of intriguing and kind of hooks your audience. It also has a central image, so in this case it's going along the line of the zebra theme, and the colors that are highlighted in the zebra correspond with the colors of points around the zebra. So again, really visually appealing, and it draws your audience in. It also has columns that structures information, so it provides information about the President's Precision Medicine Initiative, the cost, how rare informs the common, and how patients are pushing forward on this initiative. And then finally, it has a call to action. So it says, "Zebras unite. Spread the word by sharing this infographic. Do take it personally, be proud of your stripes, and find out what you can do." And then it provides a website for you to go and to provide more information and to get engaged in the initiative. So really, this infographic brings together all of the key elements that we're talking about here.
All right, so we've been talking for a long time, and we want to give you a chance to reflect a little bit on what we've been talking about. And so we have another little open-ended question poll for you here. So we're just going to bring it up. So we're wondering if you can let us know the answer to this question. So how will you apply what you learned today to your work? And feel free to just think about that for a minute and then type your answer into the box. All right, so we're getting some answers in here, which is great. I want to encourage you to keep submitting some answers. So we have people who are already doing this on a daily basis, which is great. We have people who are going to use this to make better infographics, people who are going to follow best practices, someone who might use some of these things for their 2017 annual report, so that's exciting. Sounds like this was timely. Statistical reports in Northern Ontario, using clearer graphics to present to counselors with reports to committee and council, that's awesome. Someone who's going to use the checklist to help guide their process. Someone who's going to use infographics more and pay more attention to the guidelines. Some people who are going to use these things to help with their newsletters. Awesome. These are all awesome answers. So it sounds like some people are going to use the resources and the suggestions to help enhance their work. So that's great. So I'm just going to give you 10 more seconds to add any final thoughts, and then I will close the poll. Awesome. Some people who are going to customize some things too for their workplace, and we really encourage that if you find them helpful, so that's great. So I'll just end this poll, and we'll wrap up a little bit here. So before we end the formal part of the presentation today, we wanted to leave you with some of the resources that we really found helpful in putting together this training. So we already talked about the recommended books. So those are the 3 that we showed at the beginning of the presentation, and we can't say enough good things about them. They're awesome. There's also some recommended online resources. So we just have a list of websites there that we encourage you to visit. Some of those websites have really practical information about, how to create different types of charts or some of the best practice things that we talked about. But some of those websites, like Flowing Data and Information is Beautiful, also just are great for inspiration and have some really great design to look at as well. So if you're ever feeling like you need a little bit of inspiration, we recommend visiting those.
And Kathy asked if we have a favorite among these books. Tough question. I think the Storytelling with Data did a really good job of providing step-by-step instructions. So for the purposes of trying to pull all of the information together and communicate it with our colleagues, that was very helpful for us. The data visualization by Andy Kirk was great for that inspiration piece of things, so it provided lots of interesting ideas for data visualization. So that was also a really great tool that we liked.
And Effective Data Visualization by Stephanie Evergreen also had some of that step-by-step information too. So we pulled some of those things from both of those. We had another question about, will we get the slides so we don't have to note all the resources? And Julie answered, yep, the slides are going to be posted on the website, I think along with all of the other associated tools. So you can download those documents from the Community Data Program website. So yep, the presentation and the slides will be shared as well as all the resources. So that about wraps up the formal part of the presentation. We encourage you to download those tools that we walked you through and to really try them out, adapt them for your organization if you want to, but also to feel free to provide us with any feedback about how we can make them better. And at this point, we just want to really thank you for listening today, and we'd love to answer any questions that you might have. So we'll just encourage you to type in any questions in the chat box. You're welcome, Andrew. You're welcome, Calgary. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I see a question from Kathy. Have you seen a difference in the reactions you get when you present data? Great question. I think Auburn has some good examples of that.
So when we present data, sorry, who asked that question?
Kathy D.
Kathy. So do you mean, Kathy, when you take the sort of default way of presenting data and then modify it using the best practices?
I think that's probably what she means.
So I think an example, if I'm going to go back a little bit. So I'm going to go to the breastfeeding infographic that we presented.
Yeah.
So the breastfeeding infographic was something that was done when you use visualization instead of just numbers. Yes. Okay. Great question. So this breastfeeding infographic that eventually I will get to was done in partnership with Guelph General Hospital. So they had some funding from Best Start to really encourage local, oh, there it is, okay. Oh. Okay, there it is. So they had some funding from Best Start to work to create resources for parents to encourage breastfeeding. So this infographic actually began as about a 10-page report. So we had a lot of information. The nurses that were working on this at Guelph General did a really great job of synthesizing all the data and putting it together in a report. But as you can imagine, that sort of report is not very effective for parents, especially parents of young babies that don't have a lot of time to read through things. So this infographic came out of that. So we really went through the infographic and removed things that we didn't feel like were necessary, pulled out those key pieces of data that we thought would really speak to parents. The other thing that we did is we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to a variety of different cultures. So this was translated into, I think it was 8 or 9 different languages. So that was something that we felt really strongly about. We wanted to make sure that it was accessible to all parents locally. So this was the example of the English one, obviously, but we also had other ones, and we used children of parents who spoke that language locally in Guelph to present that information, so to really make it a homegrown initiative. And now these breastfeeding pamphlets are available at physician offices and at public health in lots of different areas. So going from something like a 10-page report to a trifold pamphlet for parents to take away, we felt was really effective and has been received really positively in our community.
I think the other thing that is important to note in relation to Kathy's question about the reactions that we get when we kind of use some of these best practice visualizations as opposed to some of the defaults or just, presenting data in tables, is that it does take some work to build capacity in your organization for good data visualization. So when people are really used to seeing data presented in certain ways, even if they're not the most effective ways, sometimes they get really comfortable with that. And so even though you might present data in a way that's easier to understand and more effective, they might be a bit surprised at first. So we've been doing a lot of work internally to try to make these concepts standard across the agency so people know what to expect and they know that they're going to expect good visualizations. So there's a bit of kind of chicken and egg going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We also have a question from Julia. So how do you avoid using legends when you have a bar graph comparing 2 different pieces of data, one on the X and one on the Y, but then comparing from year to year when each year is a different color? So our legend suggestion really is just to declutter graphs. If you feel like you've created a graph that you can't remove the legend for whatever reason, or can't label directly on the bars, or can't use colors in your chart title to denote which color represents, say, years or different areas, then leave the legend if that is something that kind of fits best with that graph. So these are sort of just best practices for when it works best, but we recognize that in some cases you need to keep your x-axis or you need to keep your legend, or these are just suggestions for when you can declutter to do so.
Mm-hmm. Also consider whether you need that many pieces of data on your graph or whether you would break those into separate graphs to make them clearer and easier to interpret. Okay, we have a question from Eugene. So in an analysis that you are space constrained, so keeping it 1 to 2 pages, are there certain rules that you follow more closely when adding graphs or even structuring the narrative? That's a good question. I think, some of our questions in the worksheet are really meant to help you get down to the bottom line and to keep your visual or whatever kind of really knowledge mobilization vehicle that you choose to use concise. So really thinking about your audience, what do they need and what do they need and what is your purpose, will really help you to keep it to 1 to 2 pages.
And when you add something to those pages, think about the value added. So if you're adding in, let's say, an extra decimal point, is that decimal point worth the space that it takes up? If you're space constrained, if that's really one of your main concerns, does it matter to your audience if it's 49.2 or if it's 49%? So really, every time you put something on that page, put it on with purpose. And I think if you start approaching visuals that way, so justifying putting things on versus throwing everything on and then starting to remove what you think you can, then I think that starts to declutter and really allows you to put a lot of information that's very valuable in a small amount of space without overloading your audience.
Awesome.
So we have a question from Ella about accessibility requirements and the use of color in charts. Do you have tips on that? So Accessibility requirements, we do go through our communications department. I know not all organizations have those, but we do have an accessibility person within the communications team. So she looks at things like color contrast, sizing of font, printing in black and white, shading, that kind of thing. So if you don't have a communications person to look at things like accessibility in your visuals, then we recommend going to those two AODA or accessibility websites that we posted towards the end of the presentation. Those are really great websites for you to look at things like contrast, and it gives you a scale or a ranking of how accessible that document would be.
The other thing with accessibility that you might want to think about is when you put things up online, especially with graphs, you may have to make sure that you also explain it on your website in a paragraph format for people who are visually impaired and have screen readers. They won't be able to see your graph, and the screen reader won't be able to read your graph if it's posted in an image format. But if you have a paragraph describing your results, then the screen reader will be able to read that. So although it is great to have a visual, sometimes you also need the textual interpretation to increase accessibility, if that helps, Ella. Great. Any other thoughts on accessibility?
That's good.
Okay. Do you ever use interactive data visualizations? Question from Eric. Yeah, Auburn has some experience, and this is an area where our health unit is actually just growing in terms of our experience with interactivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been working with some tools like Power BI to create interactive dashboards, and these dashboards are something that we could share with community partners, which is something that's very important to us. So allowing our community partners to have links to these dashboards online that still update and are connected to our own systems, but can be used externally and can be interacted with externally. We've also created dashboards in Excel, so we've taken census and NHS data from 2011, and we've put all of those files together. So some of you might be familiar with the target group profiles through the community data program, and the census profiles and NHS profiles, and we've put them all together so that users can use slicers in Excel to modify what is being presented in the graphs that look like a sort of dashboard. So you could select a population of interest, like people over the age of 65, or geography of interest, so Guelph or Wellington County. So we have been playing around with that a little bit more, but mostly it's with Power BI and Excel.
Okay. Question from James. Do you have any best practices when using data viz to engage non-English speaking populations?
I guess it goes back, so some of the points that we mentioned about making sure that any icons that you're using are as intuitively recognizable as possible. So that being said, we know that there are different cultural representations of various icons, so to be really cognizant of that, I guess it goes back to the modify, the share, test, and modify step. So if you are engaging non-English speaking populations through the use of infographics or other visuals to make sure that they're included in your test audience before you release them. I guess it's you can point out here that in the breastfeeding infographic that we used visuals that were fairly universal, and so they weren't something that different cultures would interpret differently. And we also tested those with the 8 or 9 language speaking groups that we provided these infographics to.
And you made modifications based on those tests,
We
right?
did, yeah.
You're welcome, James. Are you aware of any courses offered on data visualization?
So Coursera is a really great free online program that you could look at astrophysics, or you could look at data visualization, or you could learn Italian. Like, there's lots of different options there. So I would recommend just Googling free data visualization course, and it will take you to a lot of the sort of open course data or open courses that you can access online.
We've also attended a number of really great webinars from, I'm just going back to our resources at the end, that may take a minute, but some of those blogs that we mentioned, for example, the Stephanie Evergreen blog, Those are really great, and they often offer webinars for a small fee or sometimes even for free. So if you sign up for the, what's it called? Like the feed, the news feed, or the newsletter on some of those websites, you may have access to webinars that are about data visualization. There's also some universities, like the University of Guelph, and there was another one that I just saw the other day, offer certificates in knowledge mobilization, professional certificates. And so often those certificates have components on data visualization, but they're not only about data visualization, they're about mobilizing knowledge in general. So you may be interested in checking those out. So yeah, StephanieEvergreen.com sometimes does webinars. And I believe Andy Kirk also does, we watched one of his webinars once. So there might be things there that you can check out, Laura. Any other questions out there? You're welcome. Maybe just give a few seconds for any other questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Peel says a data visualization book that they use is Data Points by Nathan Yao and Information is Beautiful by David McCandless. We have seen Information is Beautiful. We had a copy of that book as well. We think it's great for inspiration. Have you seen Data Points?
I have not. No.
Yeah, we haven't seen that book, so we'll definitely check it out. Thanks, Peel. Any other thoughts or questions out there? All right, I think we'll wrap it up. Maybe we'll hand it back to Julie or Mike in case they have anything else that they'd like to say. But thanks everyone for listening. It's been a pleasure, and we hope you.
All right, thank you for an awesome presentation.
Thanks everyone for joining. I also just wanted to point out that we will continue to be organizing webinars through the Community Data Program. We're still working on coordinating a follow-up to last year's 2016 census webinar with Statistics Canada. So it's not entirely clear when it's going to happen, hopefully in the next few months. So just keep a lookout for our next webinar. And I just want to extend a lot of thank yous are coming in through chat. I've gotten a few emails, a lot of positive reaction to your webinar, Auburn and Amy. It's really great. Thank you so much for doing this. We'll be putting this webinar recording up online as well as the materials. So thanks everyone for attending. Take care.